God bless you and welcome back to our study in the Word. Today we need faith as never before. And we've been looking one by one at the heroes of faith that are found in Hebrews chapter 11. Today we look at the greatest hero of faith in the Old Testament, which is Abraham. He's called the father of faith. Hebrews 11 verse 8 says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going." Over our next couple of lessons, we're going to be looking at three different expressions of Abraham's faith. And this today is when faith becomes really difficult. God says that I want you to step out, but I'm not going to tell you where you will end up. What happens when we're called to leave the familiar and the comfortable with no knowledge of where it will lead? It's difficult. And to step into the uncomfortable, to step into the unfamiliar. But God was calling Abraham by faith. And he was calling him to learn how to operate in the realm of the unseen and the unknown. And Abraham was willing to do that because he put his faith and trust in God. And faith operates in the area of the unseen and the unknown. And if we go back to Genesis 12, we see what God asked Abraham to do. Genesis 12 verse 1 says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, 'Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you.'" And God's very specific, the direction where Abraham is to go from. I want you to pack up. I want you to move from your father's house, leave your family, and leave the country that you know and love. But all Abraham got from God was where he was to leave from and not where he was to go to. And in other words, God told Abraham, "I'll show you where as you go step by step. I'm not going to tell you in advance. You will just have to trust me on that. You'll know when you get there." Well, that's not easy. I'm sure you will agree with me if we think of it in terms of how we live today. And we want God to be specific in his instructions to us, where we're going. As a matter of fact, we want to know the address where we'll end up. And we want to know specifically what we'll do when we get there. But God didn't do that for Abraham. And that's why faith became such an important part of his life. To say this was difficult for him, for Abraham, that's an understatement. And I'm sure you'll agree. And it would be difficult for me. And I believe it would be difficult for you as well. This is God showing us how faith operates in the area of the unknown and the unseen. And Abraham is that example for us. Genesis 12:4 says, "So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran." And whether you're 25 or 75, God may be asking you to leave what is safe and secure. And even though it may be clear where you're leaving from, it isn't always going to be clear where you're going. And those are the times when we have to put our faith and trust in the Lord, because he doesn't always give us all of the specific directions. Perhaps you've done the same ministry for many years, but God is asking you to take a step of faith. Or maybe you've lost your job, and God is calling you to try something you've never tried before. This is when we need to know that God is still God, and God is still working for our good. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." We just need to obey him and trust him with what we cannot see. Our human nature always wants to make sure of the outcome. We want to have a guarantee before we take that first step. But God says that's not faith. And He wants us to live by faith, because faith will transform every part of our lives. Hebrews 11 verse 9 says, by faith he went to the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Even though Abraham went to the promised land that we know today as Israel, he and his descendants, they didn't inherit that land as their possession in their lifetime. It would be hundreds of years later that Abraham's descendants would possess the land that was promised to him. And Abram lived by faith throughout his life. He continued to trust God. He lived in the land that God promised him, that it would be his inheritance, yet he lived like a foreigner. He lived in tents. He didn't build cities. He didn't put down permanent roots in one location. And neither did his son Isaac nor his grandson Jacob. That job would be left to their descendants hundreds of years later. But Abraham believed God's promise that eventually that whole country, that whole land would belong to his descendants. And without seeing his inheritance, Abraham obeyed God. He went there just as God commanded. And the new, unfamiliar places, they were okay with Abraham because he had his faith, not in a place, not even in a promise, but in God who makes the promises. He had faith in something that wasn't even seen yet. And his faith was firmly rooted in God. You may not be sure what and where God may be calling you, but you can be sure God is a God that you can trust and put your faith in Him. He's calling each one of us to have the kind of faith that Abraham had. And when God calls us, that we can step out in obedience, even into the unknown. Until our next time together, may the Lord richly bless you. Amen and amen.